Welcome, friends, to this webinar, Preserving Sistory, Archives, and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ persons and religious groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. We have a treat tonight, a unique opportunity to get a glimpse of the history of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, an iconoclastic international order of queer nuns that began in 1979, as well as to explore issues of how one preserves the history of a queerly decentralized movement. Tonight's presenters are first Sister Flirtatious Romanovsky of Middlesex, who was accepted into the Toronto Order of Perpetual Indulgence as a fully professed sister in 1983. Their website, sisterflirt.ca, includes a small online archive for the Toronto Order. The second presenter is Gard HOOO, the Master of Archives for the San Francisco Sisters. He earned his Master of Library and Information Science from the Pratt Institute, where he focused on data viz, museum archives and libraries, digital archives, and technical services law librarianship. Our third presenter, Nick Henderson, is the collection manager at the Australian Queer Archives. Nick has worked as a curator, archivist, and historian across national and state cultural institutions for 25 years. And for the past 20 years has been highly active at the intersection of queer histories and the glam sector across Australia. The moderator of this conversation is Melissa M. Wilcox, Ph.D., professor and Holstein Family and Community Chair of Religious Studies at the University of California, Riverside. A specialist in the study of gender, sexuality, and religion in the global North and global West, Dr. Wilcox has authored or edited 7 books, including Queer Nuns, Religion, Activism, and Serious Parody. Wilcox's current research is on spirituality in queer and trans leather, BDSM, and kink communities. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box of the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during a Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. And if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay after the webinar is concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Asadi, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome Melissa Wilcox and our illustrious panel to present Preserving History, Archives, and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those introductions. And thanks even more to all of you who've joined us here today. I'm delighted to be hosting this really exciting panel of people who've been involved in the collection and preservation of archival materials from the 3 earliest houses of Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. I've had the honor of learning from members of the order around the world and from all of the archival collections represented here today, as well as their archivists, since 2009. The Sisters, for those who are not familiar with them, are an international order of religiously unaffiliated, generally non-celibate, queer and trans nuns who will be celebrating their 45th anniversary next year. They're active on 4 continents, engaged in a variety of community service and grassroots activist work. Aside from the fact that we're focusing today on this amazing movement, what I really love about this panel is the opportunity, as Mark noted, that it offers for us to think about how decentralized grassroots movements preserve their past and their present for the storytellers of the future. I look forward to thinking together with you about keeping all of our stories alive as we listen to and/or watch these presentations. If you have questions or comments arise during the presentations, as Mark mentioned, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A right away so that we can address them after all the presentations are done, and so that you don't forget while you're listening to the others what your question was. And now I'll hand the floor over to Sister Flirt.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you to LGBTQ RAN for this opportunity to share. I do love sharing Sistory, but as a 65-year-old storyteller who rambles, I've made an outline, so you'll notice I'm constantly looking off screen, but hopefully it won't go on too long. I'll give a quick introduction to the Toronto Order before looking at the materials that are preserved and how we've gone about doing that. The Toronto Order was established in 1981 by 8 gay men inspired by the San Francisco Sisters, which we refer to as the Mother House, although we're all independent. The Toronto Order first appeared at the June 1981 Gay Pride protest march. They performed an exorcism at one of Toronto's downtown police stations to mark the February 1981 bathhouse raids that had disturbed our community. The group was never a formal organization, likely never had more than 10 active members at any one time. Offices were rotated and we operated on consensus. The final 5 of us declared the order inactive as of October 1st, 1986, because, and I quote, "Our message has been overshadowed by our appearance. Our image has blinded many to the work we were doing," unquote. Between the very short lifespan of the order, its totally unofficial nature, and the times in which we operated, there are few records or artifacts and none in a central location. Those we do have are found in multiple places in various conditions and with no centralized listing. Back when we disbanded the organization, and by the way, not one of the final five ever renounced our vows, there was no established queer archives in Canada. Both digital cameras and cell phones were very rare and expensive. Social media was limited to free nets, billboard services, and sites such as AOL and CompuServe. And my system froze. Oh, yes. And then there was great HIV/AIDS exploding. So we were sort of less focused on preserving our, what we considered minor little part of the work and getting the work done. So what we do have are a couple of main things. Is my personal archives, which is one file folder with perhaps 3 dozen documents, but also my original habit and what we have known as a summer habit, which inspired one of the songs in a sister songbook that we published. I have my original novice and black veils. Again, unlike the many of the sisters you see now, especially in the United States, the Toronto Order did what we call mishface, the lack of whiteface, and basic black outfit. But I've added various wimples, veils, and accoutrements as well. And I have 22 posts in my blog at sisterflirt.ca, which illustrate and discuss some of the materials that I do have. We have additional material being the personal archives of Sister Atrociata von Tasteless. Toronto people will probably know him as Harold Damaris. He's been a longtime community activist in a number of organizations. Fortunately, the size of his collection and the condition of materials is unknown. There was a fire in 2018 in his building, and the protective system flooded his unit and a number of others. He did tell me recently that he sent 26 boxes of information to the Gay Archives in 2021. They have not yet been processed due to COVID restrictions, a small staff, and the condition of the material after the floods. And the archives, or as they are now known, the archives, spelled ARQUIVES, was originally the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. And they started with the files of the Body Politic Collective within Pink Triangle Press. And perhaps some of the Americans watching were familiar with Body Politic. It was a national Canadian news magazine. The closest comparison would be to the Advocate here in the States. They have an extensive collection. They don't have a specific sisters collection, but if you go to their website, and I will post these links when I'm done to get the spelling correct, and you search Perpetual Indulgence, there are 118 results. Most of those, 83, are individual issues of the body politic where sisters are mentioned. There's some vertical files, there's a large collection of photographs, some moving images, and a few sound recordings. Unfortunately, there's no way to separate from their website which ones are referencing the Toronto Order. There's also references to the San Francisco Order, the Mother House, as well as the Sydney House in Australia, which, as Melissa noted, was founded around the same time. And there are a few references to specific individuals, founders such as Harold. So that's the bulk of artifacts and collections. There is additional material. There's a documentary from 2011 called Bad Habits. It's on Vimeo. It's primarily the story of the birth of the Vancouver Abbey, but it includes interviews with Sister Trociata and Sister Sadie Masochism, both from the Toronto Order, as well as Sister Mary Peter, who went from being a rogue independent nun in Toronto to joining the San Francisco Order, as well as some members of overseas orders. And again, I'll provide the link. And then throughout the web, if you search sisters, you'll find there's a couple of particular ones, some history archives that mention or have photographs of, and I have a couple of links to that. The nice thing to learn from all this is this was all done when we didn't have, as I said, basically social media. Certainly we didn't have smartphones, cell phones with those big bricks. So we still managed to create this amount of material. So certainly groups nowadays have the dubious advantage of a lot more material, information overload and getting the wheat from the chaff sort of thing. But there are definitely a lot more materials available. And certainly the website seems to be the first line of defense for preserving material and making it available. We're lucky, the Toronto Order, in the sense that we have the archives. San Francisco has their own archives, and there are growing numbers of queer archives, or in this case, our sponsoring group, providing sort of help in getting collections put together. So that they are better organized than what the Toronto Order had. Not knowing how much time I was going to have, I grabbed a few things. This was a poster. It was an 8.5-11 flyer, trying to use it so it doesn't glare too much, for an event we did, a winter solstice skating party. We all sisters operate in 4 different kinds of S's. There's the sexual, there's the spiritual, there's the silly, and there's the social. And every individual organization, every individual sister has their own combination of that. And so we did a lot of social events. We weren't particularly spiritual beyond a vague sort of pagan Wiccan earth thing that wasn't too specific, so that we weren't alienating anybody in their belief systems. And mostly we were focused on the sex and the social. We published a safer sex pamphlet inspired by the one that the San Francisco Order did. Theirs was called Play Fair. Toronto did Come Clean. That's the first edition, and that's the second edition. And again, some of the links I have show clean scans of this. So we referenced a local hassle-free clinic in Toronto to check on the medical facts on that. And as a slight side note, come clean is not a term we would use nowadays because of the suggestion that somehow we're not clean, but it comes from a blessing that San Francisco Order did when they produced their pamphlet. So we did that, and then we also had fun. We have guilt disposal bags that we would have the rather the gathered fruitful, take all their guilt and anger, rage, blow it into this, and then pop it off and disperse it into the universe, and we would declare them guilt-free, and we produced guilt-free certificates, and I revised it myself for Sister Flirt's continuing independent rogue nun ministry. So that's a quick overview. I'm almost out of time. I did want to mention that we also have been blessed Sister HOOO, or formerly Sister Who Does She Think She Is, who is in Colorado, 35-year ministry, not a Sister Perpetual Indulgence, but a Sister in Solidarity, who donates all of her materials, her monthly newsletter, local cable access channel program, to the Denver Public Library Western History Department. So there are many ways of doing your best to gather and save the material, although obviously the more access you have to a professional who can do it properly, then they'll be in better shape. And I think I've just about hit my time.
Hello, everyone. I am Guard HOOO. That is an H with 4 O's, and that stands for the Holy Orders Organizer of Ontology. A little bit of archives nerdiness there in my name. Everyone has a sister or guard name that means something special to them, and I wanted to put in my own name, my love for the archive. A little bit of history about why I look like this and I don't look like Sister Flirt or any other sister is that a lot of people may not know about the more mask-presenting persona of the sisters known as guards. We do tend to have honorifics that mirror the church in what people may imagine as a more traditional church, with brothers, sisters, popes, that sort of thing, and mother superiors, that kind of thing. But few people know about the guards, and I chose to manifest what we say as a guard because my calling specifically has to do with preservation. And the original guards were actually usually just the current paramour of the sister at the time. And they were often referred to as the purse holders. And the purse holders would, in the time before sisters were as beloved as they are now, would protect them from people who may try to cause them harm, perhaps take the money away that had been raised at an event, because as Sister Flirt mentioned, and as you probably know if you're tuned into this webinar, the American sisters have these very large headpieces that cuts off your periphery, and the guards would be the gentlemen typically, although now there's no limitation on who can become a guard or a sister, would be the protector. And so typically I am at events to collect money so that sisters can be themselves, do what they do, shake people down, and then I'm the one with the money in a bucket, putting it all in my pocket to make sure that that money gets to the beneficiary of whatever event we're doing. So that's just a little side note about the history of the guards, which some may not know. Currently, I am the Master of Archives for what we lovingly refer to as the Mother House, the San Francisco House. And I'm going to show you one of the things that I was able to put together through the wonderful funds that we were given by the Mellon Foundation. So if you just give me 1 second, I'm going to share my other screen. There we are. So just before COVID began, the Mother House had applied for and was very graciously given a grant by the community-based archives section of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This is one of the many things that we were able to do. Archive wonks will notice in the corner that it is powered by Omeka, and this is Timeline.js, which is a product of Knight Labs. It's freely available for those of you who may be archivists on the line and are wondering how you too can have such a lovely timeline. It's Timeline.js, as I said. It has interoperability with Omeka and many other archiving software. So we were able to put this together, and it's freely available. I believe that Asati is going to put the link to it in, there we are, in the chat, so that you can either follow along or refer to it later. And we put this together to just go over a very rough sketch of the founding 3 years of the Mother House in San Francisco. So this would be the landing page when you arrive. And I'm just going to go through a few of the holdings that you'll find when you go there. This is an image of the first public appearance of the sisters. I won't read every caption there. You're welcome to check it out later. But this is the iconic sister image. This is what we consider to be our founding. This took place on Easter, which is why Easter is our anniversary, and our 45th is coming up, as Professor Wilcox stated. So these original habits came with one of the founders from Iowa and are actually available for viewing in the physical archive that we have here in San Francisco. So this is where it all began. And if you would like to see this image, if you're ever in San Francisco and would like to see it in person, you're welcome to reach out to me. We'll give you my information later, but this is where it all began. I'm going to run quickly through some highlights so that you can see what happens when someone like me takes what someone like Sister Flirt has in a folder hidden away somewhere and shares it with somebody who can digitize it, put it online, make it available for scholars and the community at large. We're going to jump ahead to some intersectionality here. If you've not heard of the Radical Fairies, then I'm actually a little jealous that you get to learn about them for the first time. I'm going to let you do a search on your own, but there was quite a bit of overlap and, coming and going between the Rad Fae movement and the sisters in the early beginning. You can see here this flyer from the first gathering, and many of the original sisters and the founding sisters were there. And so we, tip our hat to the Rad Fae movement and how it was so instrumental to the founders and the originals and how they came to be. So we like to give as much as we can to the Rad Fae movement. After that gathering, as one would expect, there were not Google Forms back in the day in November 1979. So there were mimeographed applications to become a sister. And here is an example of just one. You can see that there are just a treasure trove of interesting facts about what we call the originals. So there are the 4 founders and then 12 originals. And then everyone's progeny from there springs forth into the do-gooder world. But I just love to see what people thought that their assets would be to the sisterhood. Putting down their height, proposing a name. I should note that the reason that they put down their height was because costumes were obviously, and habits were obviously a thought, because originally the sisters were kind of fancying themselves to be a dance and vaudeville type troupe. So if you're wondering why people chose to put their height on there and why it was asked, that would be why. But seeing in their own hand and in their own words what these original sisters wanted to bring to the order is important, and something that we wanted not just members of the order or academics, but just also the public to see. So that's why we included that here. Here we find our original holy card. This was passed out to the community to introduce the sisters to, the public in general, also to let them know that if someone said that they were a sister, that they really were, now we have name tags, which you can perhaps see that I have there, and the iconic makeup. But before, there was actually some arrests made related to panhandling and being out in the public asking for money. Before that was really something that the sisters were known for. And this holy card was a way for the sisters to identify themselves to the public. You can see the inspiration there. Here we have the Nuns Wanted ad. This, as I was referring to earlier, put out the call for the group, the performance group that was looking to be built from within the sisterhood. And so this appeared in the City Arts Classified. You'll see that it is this little ad here is what started the ball rolling. We had spoken a little bit about the large headpieces that are worn. This is actually the inspiration for those headpieces. It's up to each nun to have their look be what they make of it. Some orders, houses, like Toronto, as Sister Flirt said, don't necessarily need to use it. Each order is independent. But this was the inspiration for the original habit and what we call the ear boobs. And you can see in the notes there, handwritten, what they should and should not be. And now when a sister elevates to being a fully professed member of the order gifts, at least in the San Francisco house, their formal habit and the large headpiece. We have the original fabric that was used and the original cutouts, pieces, all of that in the archive for viewing. Again, speaking to how the order had a lot of associations with religion, but not just traditional religion. There was, through the Radfay movement, paganism, there were often, the full moon ritual is one example of more pagan focused ceremonies that were done by the sisters. Wanted to highlight that here. And then moving into some of the more political and grassroots movement work that the sisters have come to be known for. This was the first appearance of the sisters in habit as a group and for a cause. So before it was performances and what we call bar ministry, and now the sisters started to organize, come together, put their voices behind causes. This was the first and certainly not the last. We have some other examples coming up. This benefit that happened in October of 1980 was our first bingo benefit, and it was for gay Cuban refugees. Big success. Bingo has become a little bit of a no-no now that there are laws against gambling and nonprofits, which we are a 501c3. And so we have, a little hesitancy about running bingos, but back in the day, they were smash fundraiser, and we put our habits on and raised money to help not just the refugees, but many other organizations, which we will get to in a moment. Here's another example of how the order helped with gay, what we would call now affinity groups within churches. We would often be, or they back then would often be invited to speak to those gay caucuses. And here is just a thank you letter from the Unitarian Church here in San Francisco. The War Resisters League was also an organization that Sister Boom Boom and Teresa Stigmata were involved with. And so we wanted to highlight that. Obviously, at the time, 1981, you can imagine what was going on at the time and why sisters would be against war. And then here we have the first annual, of which there were only 2, dog shows. And the reason I included this is because this is arguably the first fundraiser for AIDS in the country, and not just by the sisters, but nationwide. It was to benefit the Carpacious Sarcoma Foundation before AIDS had a name, before it was GRID, before it was HIV. It just was known to be that people in our community were developing KS, and so the sisters banded together and had a dog show to raise money for it. There were only 2 annual dog shows, but they have started to come back where communities invite today's sisters to their dog shows as a nod to that first 2. And we always show up for the dog show because who doesn't love a dog show? Dog and pony show, sisters show up. Something else at the time, as you can imagine, everything old is new again, unfortunately, but there was a lot of talk of gay teachers losing their jobs in the 80s. And so it was something that the sisters were very passionate about, putting out positive images of queer people. If you think of Drag Queen Story Hour, those kinds of things started with things like the Gay Teachers Benefit. And quickly, we are reaching the end of the 79 to 82 timeline that I promised. But you know, sisters were always involved with politics here in the city because being queer is a political act. Putting on whiteface, going out, shaking your fist in the air is a political act. And this was just one of the many victories that the sisters helped to celebrate. You can read that in the caption there, and you can find out more later in the timeline. And that is all from me. Again, that there is so much more in the physical sister archive in San Francisco. You are welcome to set up a time to come visit. I love having visitors. You don't have to be a scholar or be working on anything. If you are just in town and would like to come, we welcome you to come. We may have you wear white gloves or not touch anything, but we would love to have you. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat, but I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nick Henderson, and thank you for the lovely introduction at the beginning. As you can see on my little handle, I'm in Bunurong land, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, something that we traditionally do in Australia in acknowledging First Nations people, particularly in the context of, we've just had an Invasion Day, which was yesterday in Australia. So I'm going to show a little slideshow, and hopefully it comes up in some of the audio. So bear with me as I pop that one on. Oh. Okay. So hopefully that's coming up okay. So as mentioned before, I'm involved, the archives that I'm involved in is the Australian Queer Archives, or AQUA. we were established in 1978 as the Australian Gay Archives. Part of that first wave of, I guess, archival community activism that was undertaken in the 1970s. We came out of a coalitionist activist politic of gay men and lesbians who were trying to document the early part of their movement when the mainstream community was either hostile or completely disinterested. More specifically, our archive was established by teacher union activists. So why do we collect, why does ACWA collect and celebrate Sisters Archives? So for us, it's a number of reasons, but the most core part of that is that it meets our collection criteria of documenting Australian LGBTQ life. But beyond that, in a specific sense, many of the Sisters Archives in Australia also intersect with many related movements and activist work. In terms of the Sisters activism in Australia, much of that was undertaken as part of collaborations, so part of campaigns like the Campaign Against Repression, and many of the sisters were also simultaneously part of other activist groups like the Gay Liberation Choir, the Gay Solidarity Group, and Gay Waves. So when we're seeing these sister collections as part of a broader archive and overall collection, it's really part of a more interlinked notion of community, of individuals, of organisations, and of movements. Also on a personal level, as someone involved in community and undertaking this work, I've formed personal connections with many of the sisters, and I particularly admire their work, their activism, their creativity, and particularly their humour. And these are kind of aspects of our queer histories that I'm keen to celebrate. So while the archives has acquired sister collections almost since our inception in 1978. Obviously, the Australian movement and order in the Sydney House was set up in 1981, and subsequent houses around Australia in places like Melbourne in 1983 and Adelaide, Perth and others houses. We would collect that material as part of our process of acquiring a community paper, or it could be ephemera or flyers. But our first collection and specific sisterly collection relates to Sister Barbarella Ars Erotica, and these are some of the material from that collection on screen. Sister Barbarella, also known as Bruce Belcher, died of AIDS-related illness in 1994, and his collection was received soon after. If you're wondering how he got his name, he also had a company making dildos, and you can see that lovely bouquet of dildos on the right. His collection also included material like Nunchin minutes, and you can see some of those down below. So following our receipt of this collection in the mid-1990s, there was an almost 20-year gap before we received the next major collection. And that was from founding sister, Mary Medusa, later known as Sister May Call of the Wild, or Gary Schliemann. So Gary had been traveling in the United States in the early 1980s. He'd traveled to the US, to Canada, and also to Mexico. And I thought I'd play a little bit of audio, and you can see the little tape that's there that comes from his papers. And this little bit of audio comes from an interview that he gave on his return to Australia on Gay Waves, which was a community-based radio program in Sydney. So just to flag, some of this audio may be a little quiet, so please turn up your sound and hopefully you can hear this one.
But I ended up staying in a house on Ashbury, in the Haight-Ashbury district, and second morning I woke up there, and Fred Brungard, in whose room I was staying, rushed in a habit.
What do you mean in a habit? I mean, we all have habits of one kind or another. What do you mean in a habit?
Oh, this was a gay male nun's habit.
A real habit.
The real thing.
And so there's an order in San Francisco.
The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
Oh, that's what they call themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Just tell us something briefly about them. I know that we're going to hear a tape in a moment or two of some of the things that they've done, but perhaps you might just like to tell us something about the sisters before we hear the tape.
Well, I'll just read a little blurb. We're an order of gay male nuns dedicated to the promulgation of universal joy and the expiation of stigmatic guilt. Our ministry is one of public manifestation and habitual perpetration. They're
Sounds pretty direct.
oh yeah, they're pretty direct.
Mm.
They have a fine time in the streets of San Francisco.
Mm.
Fantastic. So I thought I would play a bit more of that audio just to give you a sense of both the diversity of material in the archives, but also because I'm very keen for archives to speak and for individuals to speak for themselves through the archival collections. Some of the other material that you can see on screen includes the fairy directory from the second Radical Fairy gathering, and Gary had gone across to America to go to that gathering, which is where he'd met Harry Hay and travelled with him before staying with Fred, aka Sister Missionary Position. And you can also see some material like the house book from Gary's the Convent of the Seven Leaps Forward, or the Wellington Boot, which was the communal household that Gary lived in. Whoops.
But
Let me pop that one forward. Not so long after we received Gary's papers, we received the papers of Mother Inferior, or also known as Mother Abyss, and many other names through their activist career and life. Mother Inferior was one of the founding sisters in the Sydney House, and their papers also incorporated much of the records of the Sydney House from its inception up to the mid-1990s. So this included the main Nunchin minute books and much of the administrative documentation. Mother Inferior had been an archivist and had worked at the State Records in Sydney, and so had been really a natural fit in terms of maintaining and building those. So you can see a few examples of some of their papers on screen, including the lovely banner on the lower left, which is one of the early banners, artwork, photographs, and that Nunchin minute book on the left. So I guess over this period, since receiving these collections, we've received the papers of 7 sisters and 4 saints. We've also received a number of other collections that really flesh out that history. When I played before, the material from the radio program that Gary had donated, we have a very large collection documenting Gay Waves, the radio program, about 2,000 hours of material from 1980 to 2005. And so it was a weekly 3-hour program, and many sisters were both part of the collective, but had also been interviewed on the program. So Gay Waves was both significant in terms of initiating sisters in Australia, linking Gary with Fabian, but also there was special episodes like recordings of the SPI reliquary at the 9th National Homosexual Conference. There was live canonizations, and there was also a weekly safe sex program that was broadcast, or safe sex segment that was broadcast in the mid-1980s. Now, I thought I would just include a little extra bit of audio. I hope this won't go too long, but this relates to the litany, which is in the middle here. And most of these items on screen come from Fabian's papers, relate to, obviously, the San Francisco Mother House. And I'll just play this little bit of audio here.
Thank you. Good evening. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence march with you tonight in solidarity with our brothers and sisters here and around the world. We come in memory of our slain comrades, George and Harvey, the men in New York City, the man in Buena Vista Park, those slaughtered in Dolores Park and all over the streets of San Francisco. We come tonight to honor our martyrs of homophobic violence. We would like to lead you in closing benediction. The form of this benediction is a litany. One of our sisters will deliver the invocation and declarations. and all of us are invited to make the group response. It is a prayer of empowerment and healing for these violent crimes.
I might just stop it there because it does go on a bit, but it is a really fantastic audio that really captures the activism of the San Francisco sisters in those early years. So, you know, obviously this audio material is pretty powerful, and I think it's, for me, it's one of the most significant aspects of the archival documentation of the sisters in Australia, as it really gives voice to that moment of the sisters at a point in time, and allows us a really clear insight into the sisters and their activism. I think one of the things that it shows for me as a community archivist is that even within the context of personal papers or the records of a house, is that there's often really significant material dispersed in different ways. And often we need to see that the process of doing and undertaking community archiving means that, you know, items like community radio programs or other forms of documentation, it could be audiovisual, it could be oral history, form a really important part in fleshing out that story. So I don't have too much, whoops, apologies. If I can pop forward. The last slide I was just going to highlight, and we saw an image before of the Come Clean brochure from Toronto. There's other material on screen from different houses, but Toronto and also from Germany. This is just to highlight that much of the material that ends up in terms of the correspondence going back and forth between sisters and their international networks can find their way into different collections. This material comes from Fabian's papers, from Mother Inferior, but there's a whole range of other material. So hopefully that gives a bit of an insight into the sisters and the Australian Queer Archives, and hopefully that was all legible. Thank you.
Well, I hope that those presentations gave all of you at least a little bit of a sense of the thrill that we all have in working with archival materials, how exciting it is to step back into the past, whether it's your own past for those of you who were around when these things happened, whether it's a past you've heard about or something that's completely new to you, to be able to hear the voices, to be able to see what people were producing, what they were doing, and get a sense for the stories. So we have 8 minutes, if we stick very strictly to our schedule, for Q&A. I want to note that there is a question very specific to Sister Flirt at the very top of the chat. And I wonder, Sister Flirt, if you might want to address that directly. And so I'm going to a question in the Q&A section that is broader, that anybody can take up and answer. This is a question from Will Bryant. What role did the sisters play during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic during the 80s? Anybody want to pick up on that?
Yeah, so both San Francisco and Toronto were, and Sydney were established before the outbreak that became recognized as AIDS, and all of us quickly turned to working on that. The Safer Sex pamphlets that I showed based on one San Francisco did, fundraising, hospice visits. The question was, how was the question worded? How did we get involved, or were we involved? What was the wording of the question?
The precise question is, what role did the sisters play?
Being sisters, being community, fundraising, sitting in hospice, organizing candlelight vigils, making a bit of humor about it. So we had, in Toronto, we passed out, we would go to Hassle Free, which was the local free clinic where people were being tested, and hand out a certificate that they could give to somebody and say, I'd love to play with you, get back to me in 2 weeks because I'm off market for being tested and stuff like that. So we tried to bring humor and sex positivity and fundraise. So I don't know who knows about the San Francisco response.
There was everything that you said in San Francisco. I think something else that was important that was done here, specifically with going to not just hospice care and hospitals, but in the homes of people who were about to pass through the veil, as we like to say. There were sisters that performed last rites when, you know, the church turned their back on people that were welcome to sing in their choirs until they got sick or developed sores, or would not mention them when their family members asked specifically for prayers to come from the congregation. So the sisters filled that role. They would go to people's homes, hold the hands of those who were suffering, and, as I said, give last rites to some who requested them.
I also quickly want to mention Bobby Campbell, whose character is portrayed in the so We Were Here. What was the book? The book and then a mini series about the early days of San Francisco. I'm blanking on it. Not Mark.
For those who don't know who Bobby Campbell was, he was on the cover of Newsweek as the AIDS poster boy. Right. And his partner at the time were there. He was one of the first sisters here in San Francisco. Yes. Very out, very vocal with destigmatizing HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, Sister Florence Nightmare RN. And in the documentary, the fictionalized documentary whose name I'm blanking on, is a 6-part series, 5-part series on TV. He is shown, his character is shown taking photographs of his KS lesions, posting them on the window. I believe it was the camera store that I'm blanking again on names that are Saint operated, and said, "Do you know about this? Like, look into this." And then he also was instrumental in the San Francisco Sisters safe-sex pamphlet.
You got it, sister. Was We Were Here.
And I thought I might just also add, like the pamphlet that was done in San Francisco, in addition to inspiring the pamphlet in Toronto, also inspired pamphlets in Australia. One of the first that was produced here in Melbourne, the Victorian AIDS Council, or Victorian AIDS Action Council, was first formed in 1983. Their first pamphlet was based on the Sisters pamphlet. You know, it was incredibly influential in terms of early HIV/AIDS, you know, education information before it became more well known. In the Australian context, I think I mentioned that radio program and segment that was done every week on Gay Waves that was broadcast, but they were also involved in terms of things like partnering with ACT UP on exorcisms of the jail, because the jail wasn't providing, one of the jails weren't providing condoms to people. You know, they were out there in public in a lot of different ways, and often in really creative ways like exorcisms in protest.
And also partnering with organizations like HOOO here in San Francisco to, you know, make sure that people were safe, with Community United Against Violence, excuse me for using the acronym without spelling it out. You know, just walking people home sometimes even was an important way that, you know, during to and from appointment that the sisters were able to help people who were, you know, living with HIV/AIDS.
And my apologies if this has already been said, but I think that one of the things that's really important about that Playfair pamphlet from San Francisco is that, to my knowledge, it is the first sex-positive safer sex guide for gay men, period. It's also chilling to read because it is before the identification, even its naming as GRID, problematic as that is, before the identification of AIDS at all. And so there are these mentions about, hey, there are these new illnesses showing up and we're not sure what they are, but hopefully everything will be fine. And it again, the power of archival work. Now, I'm not seeing any other questions unless there are hands raised that I'm not seeing, but I don't believe so. Are there any other questions that people, oh, something just popped up. Question for Nick, does Aqua have Gay Waves digitized?
Yes, we've got about 1,500 hours digitized. We're in the process. We got a grant to do digitization of 1/4-inch reels. We have a mixture of 1/4-inch reels and cassette tapes. And I've just sent another batch out, so we'll have more coming in. One of the pleasures of doing audio digitization is the need to do things like baking of the tapes and playing it at times. So it takes a little while to get them done, but they're all coming in.
Nick, I don't know if you answered the question as it popped up, but Neil wanted to know if that was David Urquhart. If I'm spelling that pronunciation.
No, you're absolutely correct. I think I did pop it in. It is David Urquhart, or then known as David James, who was one of the who was the interviewer. Yep.
Mark wants to know if there's a story behind the naming of the order. Who wants to take that one? Sister Flirt.
A story? No, there are stories, plural. And your book certainly has captured the current consensus, which is we're not 100% sure because we were all silly that night. We don't know what month it was. And we talked about a lot of things, including the order down the street, and it was a play on words, and we're all dropouts from priest training. And so, yeah, so it's best to say that there's it's open to the wind.
I do think that the extent of Catholic education among some of the founders and originals made the parody particularly smart and sharp in the order, and certainly the reference to the medieval practice of selling indulgences is not accidental, except in this case the indulgences are perpetual and are not for sale, just freely given.
Melissa, I don't know, I did see Sister Vishnu raise their hand.
Thank you so much. And I would love to have Sister Vish jump in. You should be able to unmute, Sister.
Oh, maybe
Asati, is there a way to invite Sister Vishnu to speak?
Oh, they can't unmute. Okay.
Okay, so Sister Vish, if you can't see the chat, you're being asked, the way that the webinar is set up, participants can't unmute. So if you could put your question in the chat, if you could type your question in, we can wait here for a bit while you type it. And I'm also checking the Q&A again.
I'm not sure they had a question so much as perhaps they were going to give us their view as one of the founders. So I don't know if they can be invited in to participant status, or are we maxed out?
While we're waiting, there's also a question from BK Wells. What are the future plans for each archive?
So the Mother House, as I said, received a very generous grant from the Mellon Foundation. We were quite literally able to take the folders that sisters like Sister Flirt in San Francisco had collected and bring them out of their closets and into a temperature controlled closet that we were able to pay for down on Market Street. So we're looking to expand. We will generously accept donations for that effort. And we in the community provide talks like this. We go to people's homes. We present for affinity groups at corporate headquarters around the Bay. And so we are always open to that kind of collaboration. We're looking to expand more into oral history, and that is going to be the focus for 2023 in San Francisco.
Sister Flirt or Nick, do you want to say anything? Sister Vishnu's been able to join us as well, but maybe we'll just wrap this question up.
Oh, just to say that, the Australian Queer Archives, I popped the link in the chat. We've been going 45 years where nothing's stopping us in terms of our space. So we'll continue to be collecting material and making it more accessible. We currently have a project with some academics looking at the sisters' use of relics. A couple of academics actually from the Australian Catholic University who are looking at queer medievalism and relics. And so we'll be doing some projects around that material in the collection. There's also other wonderful things. The West Australian Museum has a much venerated by the Perth House a glory hole, which was kept by the order, saved, as many of the relics have been. In Sydney, there was a relic which was a urinal trough from a public toilet, which was used as a baptismal font for many years by the sister house and by the Sydney House. So we'll be doing a lot of work around these as well.
I'm not a formal archive. It's my little collection, which will be donated in time to join with Sister Tosiada's much larger donation to the archives or the archives. I'm not sure how they're pronouncing it here, back in Toronto. That will be where mine goes.
So, Sister Vish, of course, I want to give you the floor. Let me also say that we're past the time when we promised to wrap up. So I think, and wrapping up doesn't mean leaving. As Mark mentioned at the beginning, we are transitioning over to a more informal, this is the Zoom version of the meet and greet after the talk, after the panel. And so I think what I'd like to do for those that need to go but are waiting for the formal end is to thank all of our presenters, and thank the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network for sponsoring and having the idea about this fantastic, exciting panel. And say, if you've come here for sort of the formal thing and you were waiting for closure, here's your closure. And let's go ahead and transition with what Sister Vishnu wanted to share.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No.
Yes, we can.
Yes, sister.
Oh, you can. Okay, great. I was having trouble logging on. So it's very short, like 10 seconds here. Yeah, we weren't even sure of the address when we met to form our name and mission statement, but I believe it was on Frederick Street. Our calligrapher who made the banner, I think it was his house. And I remember we're throwing around combinations of words, and one was perpetual, and we couldn't quite get it right. And I had to go to the bathroom. I came out and they had the name. So I always assumed that it was Mish because of her seminary experience. She claimed credit for it, and then about 10 years admitted, no, it wasn't me, and she couldn't remember who actually put the right words together. But there was a Catholic convent just down the street from what became our convent, and it was the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. So I think that had something to do with it, perpetual, you know. We actually did sell some indulgences in the early days to raise funds, along with T-shirts and holy cards. There you go.
Thank you so much, Melissa, Sister Flirt, Guard HOOO, and Nick, for this informative and just amazing presentation. Those of you who have been watching this webinar will receive an email in a few days with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ RAN website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinar on February 9th, Preserving Your Web Presence on the Internet Archive, will be a hands-on workshop about using the Internet Archive's free services to document and preserve your or your organization's online activities. Then on March 8th, LGBTQ RAN will collaborate with Union Theological Seminary in New York City to present the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award for Papers. That will be LGBTQ RAN's first in-person event since the pandemic, and will also be live streamed for anyone to watch. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make that happen with your gift. Finally, I remind you, if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to one of the presenters, stay here and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Thank you once again, Melissa, Sister Flirt, Guard HOOO, and Nick for your outstanding presentations. Good night to all.